Welcome to the Jesus Table podcast. Join Dr. Nick Venditti, co-founder of Instead Global Bible College, and Eliott Reyna, youth pastor at Life Church Central, as we get to know Jesus through the Bible.
Welcome, everyone, to the Jesus Table podcast. We are studying Hebrews together, so thank you for joining this Bible study. The fact that you clicked on this already says so much that you want to learn more about the Bible and Jesus through the Bible, so thank you for joining us. We are looking at different passages in Hebrews that talk about how Jesus is greater than or better than different things, people, and today we are sort of combining three parts, if you will, that talk about Jesus being better or greater than. Jesus is a better hope. Jesus has better promises and the guarantee of a better covenant. So we're kind of combining these three because these three thoughts, even though we could do an episode on each, sort of go together. And so we're like, let's just combine them because they're very linked in what the author of Hebrews is trying to explain. So I'll start with the first one, which is found in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 18 and 19. So I'll go ahead and read that, and then I'll toss it over to you, Doc, to sort of give us an explanation of what he's referring to, and then we can go from there if that sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Hebrews 7, 18 and 19 says this. So the previous command is annulled because it was weak and unprofitable, for the law perfected nothing. But a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. So, Doc, what is this better hope compared to what other hope is he referring to?
Well, it's curious, and I think to understand this, first of all, it's drawn, or the language is really worship language, entering into God's presence. And the reason why I say that is because at the end of verse 19, it says, we draw near to God. So we have to think of the tabernacle, or we have to think of the holy place in part of this. And it talks about a better hope. In other words, that through Jesus, we have a better hope that we can draw near to God. Let's not forget, in the Old Testament, where it was only the high priest that could really walk in or go into the Holy of Holies, and that was once a year. And we've done a lot of talking regarding that. But here it says that we have a better hope. It talks about believers having a better hope because now we can draw near to God. And of course, by perfect here, it means that we can have access, total access to God through Jesus Christ. That's why we have a better hope. Before Israel had a hope, they were expecting the Messiah, but at the same time, they didn't have access to that. But here, now, they do have access through Jesus Christ, which is the whole argument, or one of the major arguments of Jesus being not only the high priest, but also the sacrifice. And chapter 10, I think verses 18 through 20, 21, something like that, says the new and living way. So we have a way that we have not only access, but a better hope because of what Jesus has done. And it sounds a little complicated. Verse 19 says, for the law made nothing perfect. In other words, it was all a foreshadowing. It was a looking towards, but it came to perfection, if you want, or completion through what Jesus did, his death and sacrifice. So I think that's basically. And I really like the fact that we're going to be doing today's series, not just, we've done better than angels, better than Moses, but doing it this way because there is an overlap for us to understand. The covenant is part of the better hope, and the covenant is also part of the better promises. So these three betters, if I can use that phrase, these three betters are better when they're looked at together. I hope that makes sense to our listeners. But anyway.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, that's really good. I know we always are trying to connect it with saying this is a part of the larger narrative in Scripture. But you can see why, because they're the authors of the New Testament are constantly trying to say, hey, you remember that of the Old Testament? Well, this is the fulfillment of, or the meaning of, or the point of it all. So, so in the passage, it says the previous command is annulled because it was weak and unprofitable. And then in parentheses, in my Bible, it says, for the law perfected nothing. Or like you said, it can be translated, the law completed nothing, and this is not just here in Hebrews. This is in Romans. This is in Galatians. Paul makes this point over and over again that, that he's talking about the law, or in this case, it says the previous command, or verse 19, the law. So if our listeners are maybe not familiar with what that is, what is the previous command or the law? Is it just talking about the Ten Commandments? Because sometimes the law is referred to as Ten Commandments. Is it talking about the Old Testament as a whole? Because sometimes when the Bible or the New Testament talks about the law, it's talking about the Old Testament as a whole. So what is this case, the previous command or the law that couldn't complete anything?
It's curious because your translation says annulled, and the translation that I have here says put aside. It's it's really the sense of being temporary, that it wasn't meant to be all the time eternal, if I can use that. And it's not annulling the Ten Commandments. We still need to worship God. We still shouldn't lie. We shouldn't cheat. We still need to honor our parents, etc. And when you mentioned the Tanakh, it's the Old Testament, and there are certain things regarding the Old Testament that still have to be fulfilled, So it's a combination of all of the above, if I can say that. There are certain things that have been fulfilled, but there are other things that will continue to be fulfilled. And it's good that you mentioned Romans and Galatians, because that helps us to understand, especially Romans 9, 10, and 11, those chapters regarding Israel, because there are still promises for Israel. So it's a combination of the both, and we need to be very careful understanding all of this, because of the fact there are some people that say and believe that God just has two people, or had two people. For example, there's Israel and the Gentiles, and there are others that believe that all the promises to Israel have been fulfilled, so God sort of discarded Israel, and now the church is the new Israel, And we have to be careful with both those, because I firmly believe, and I think, in our discussions over these months, we've come to the conclusion that it's neither Jew nor Greek. Of the two, he made one people, and they all come under Jesus, the Messiah, who is the sacrifice. And again, that's part of the better hope that we have. And when I say we, it's also Jews and Gentiles that believe in Jesus.
Right. That's really well put. The Galatians chapter 3 says that after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. It refers to the law was a tutor, like that idea that you just said, that set aside or temporary, not that it was evil. For Jesus himself said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Exactly. He is the fulfillment of it. It was here, part of the story, and you can read it in the Old Testament, but it was always pointing towards Jesus. It was never supposed to be the end of itself. So Hebrews is helping us with that. He's saying, hey, there is a better hope that's introduced here. That's Jesus, obviously. So this being the better hope that we have, and then continuing the thought, goes from verse 20 to 22. You want me to go ahead and read that, or is there something else you wanted to mention before?
No, that's perfect. No, that's good that we do it this way. Yeah.
Okay, so continuing the thought, verse 20 to 22 says this: None of this happened without an oath, for others became priests without an oath, but he became a priest with an oath made by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. We talked about that in our Melchizedek episode. Exactly. Verse 22, because of this oath, Jesus has also become the guarantee of a better covenant. So here's the second better that we're looking at today. Better hope tied to a better covenant. So if there's a better covenant, that means there was a covenant that was not better. So what is the covenant that is not the better one, and which is the better one? What's he referring to here?
Okay, I mean, again, as we always say, we can do not one, we could probably do half a dozen series episodes on covenant. Because
Yeah.
it goes, from the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, all the way to the end of the Bible, really, fulfillment of the heavens, and new earth. And the use of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and throughout the scriptures. So let me try to make this as succinct as possible. Better covenant, the covenant as believers in Jesus, we are part of the covenant people first of all, because He's the Messiah that was promised in the Old Testament. Apart from that, Jesus being the Messiah or the Redeemer, we also have the covenant, and we could trace. It's really, it depends which way we look at it. I think there's one covenant, but there are different parts to that covenant made out through human history. The
Mhm.
first covenant is what's called in covenant theology the Abrahamic, or the covenant made to Abraham. you know, and we see that in Genesis chapter 12. And even before that, you see that in Genesis 3:15 when the promise of the Messiah, the proto-evangelium, as we said, the first time the gospel is mentioned. So this is all a foreshadowing as time goes by. We have that promise to Abraham that through his seed, the nations would be blessed, and also
Mhm.
the promise of a land to Israel and his descendants. So we also have the promises made, or the covenant made with Moses and Israel, that they would be his people, chosen people. But again, it was not at the exclusion of. I think that's one of the challenges many times when we try to interpret the Bible and covenant, because there are some that use Israel and Moses, the covenant that God made to them, at the exclusion of everybody. In other words, we're
Mhm.
the only good guys on the block, if I can
Right.
use that. And I don't think that's the intention, the biblical intention of it. Yes, there is a certain role of Israel as a nation. There was a certain role of Moses as a person, but at the same time, that role was not at the exclusion of everyone. It was They were to be examples, and the nations were to use or see in Israel that covenant, and wanting to and desiring that covenant be a part of God's people. Then, of course, there's the covenant that God made exclusively with David about his family, his genealogy. That's why it's so important for us to understand the role of the covenant, and especially in Matthew chapter 1, where it talks about the genealogy. And the genealogy there in Matthew starts with Abraham, but also includes David. So
Mhm.
it's very important for us to understand through the flow of history how God was continually showing his faithfulness to the covenant, to his promises. And if we remember that the promise to David, that from his loins or from his genealogy would the Messiah would be born, you know?
Yeah.
So that's why all of this is so important for us to understand. We're talking about a period roughly of about 2,000 years. Abraham lived approximately 2,000 years before Moses, 1,400 years. We have King David roughly 1,000 years before Jesus was born. So,
Mhm.
as our author again reminds us, God having spoken in the past, through the prophets, through his people, you see the flow of history, things happening, but God being faithful to that promise and to that covenant. And of course, the fulfillment of the covenant is the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is that Messiah that we expected. When I say we, humanity is what I mean by that.
Mhm.
We expected that, and some people expected. You see in Simeon, for example, and you see that also in Hannah. They were expecting the Messiah to come, and there were
Mhm.
many that were expecting. That's the fulfillment of that provident, the prominence of covenant. That here he is, the baby Jesus in the arms of Simeon, in the temple and the whole scene. Again, we don't have had too much time to develop that argument, but the importance of that, it really, really is. And the promise that they would see them, the coming of the Messiah. And that's God's covenant. And later on in Hebrews, the author makes a very big deal about using Jeremiah chapter 31, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
The whole, and as a matter of fact, I think it's the largest quote of that passage in the New Testament.
Mm.
Where he promises that better covenant, and it's to
The heart.
Jeremiah, the heart, exactly. So I mean, all of this to say that we have a better hope because of the covenant. And also, the author here in the New Testament tells us, even though Israel failed, they failed in keeping the covenant. God continues to be faithful, and that's why here we also see it says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change His mind. You are a priest forever," and the guarantor of a better covenant. The covenant was fulfilled not only in Jesus, but also the covenant was fulfilled because God was faithful to fulfill that covenant, even
Right.
though Israel and the people of God have failed through the centuries. But the promise doesn't lie on us fulfilling that, but rather us responding in obedience and in faith to God's faithfulness.
That's good. I like that.
Yeah.
It's not based on our faithfulness and us
Right.
earning it. Rather, God has showed Himself faithful
Right.
by keeping His promise, His hope, His covenant. So good. So, if I understood you correctly, you're saying there is just one covenant, really.
Well, I would say,
Yeah, and then within that, but here he's referring to that this is a better covenant. So there's a contrast of better. I've heard it referred to as the new covenant versus the old covenant.
Yeah.
Some people don't like that terminology because it's saying that you're pushing that there is, in a sense, two different covenants.
Yeah.
And you said there is not two different people. There's not two different promises. At the end of the day, it was one promise, Jesus. It is one people of God.
Yeah.
But and then you mentioned that there's different covenants, so to speak, throughout the story, right? That to Abraham, they call it the Abrahamic covenant, to Noah, to David, etc.
Exactly.
So I guess, how could you help us understand that there's different covenants, but there's really one covenant?
Right.
There seems to be a better covenant now compared to the old covenant, but it's really just the same covenant. If someone gets a little confused with that, how would you sort of help them understand that there's that tension, if you will?
Okay, if I can use this illustration, there's the capital C covenant, which is the overall covenant in Jesus Christ that God promised. But under that, there's covenant small a, covenant small b, covenant, if this was an outline, covenant small c. So that all of these other covenants, it doesn't minimize the covenant per se, but it's a part of the larger picture.
Okay, that's good. That helps. It's kind of like one big part, and these are
subplots
on top of it, if you will. So okay, that's great. And that kind of shows that it's all connected, that the New Testament isn't here trying to create a new religion, and saying, forget the old stuff. This is something new and fresh and brand new, and you've never seen it before, but rather it's a completion of what has always been promised, like you said in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, that He'd take away our heart of stone, put in a heart of flesh, etc., etc. We could be here all day. So, okay, really good. Then we'll jump to our last verse for today. We'll jump into the next chapter. We would love to read the whole thing, but for time's sake, we're doing this. But please go ahead and read this. All of you who are listening can read chapter 7 and chapter 8 together, as you'll see that it's one continuous thought that he's talking about. Continues to talk about the better promise and the oath and the high priest. And then in chapter 8, verse 6, he picks up on this, continuing, and says, "But Jesus has now obtained a superior ministry, and to that degree he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been established on better promises." So once again, we see the same word, better covenant, that we just looked at in verse 22 of chapter 7. And then he says better promises. So we have a better hope, better covenant, and better promises. So I guess to do the comparison one more time, what is he referring to was the previous promises that weren't better. And then what are these better promises that he is contrasting here?
Again, yeah, I mean, these are great questions, Elliot. I appreciate them very much, and I hope I do justice to your answer to answer them. Uh, Sometimes we think, and we've said this before, better does not eliminate the previous. It just says it's better. It's different, but at the same time, it's a fulfillment. That's why it's what some theologians call the already and the not yet. You know, we're going through history. Human history has not come to an end yet. That will come to an end, you know, when Jesus is second coming, and also the judgment. But what it really means is, as we travel, as we continue to be part of God's people and God's plan, uh, things are fulfilled, but they're not fully fulfilled yet. That's why I use the term already and not yet. In other words, we see how we can look back and we could say, "Oh yeah, look at this! God spoke to Moses. God spoke." And thank you for bringing up Noah, which was another covenant that God also made. You know, and we look back and we say, "Yeah, look! In human history, God spoke to Abraham. He spoke to all the others. He fulfilled that." But we continue still going through the better parts of the covenant, the promises, and what God has promised. So now here we are in the 21st century, and we can look back, but at the same time we can look forward, because all of it has not been fulfilled yet, in the sense that yes, Jesus died, yes, Jesus rose from the dead, and he's at the right hand of the Father, which is also very important for the author of Hebrews, because at the right hand of the Father he's an intercessor, he's a greater high priest. He's the eternal high priest, you know? And then looking towards the future, we have that better hope. Well, what is that better hope? That one day we will see Jesus as he is, as Paul reminds us in Corinthians, if I remember correctly. And we'll be in the presence of God for eternity, as Revelation makes very clear in chapters 21 and 22. So it builds up hope, but that hope is an expectation, if I can use that word, because we look back and we say, look how faithful God was. We look right here to the present, in the midst of everything else, God continues to be faithful. And of course, that hope gives us that expectation for the future. And I say hope, well, the author mentions hope, but hope is something that we need very, very much. There's a lot of talk globally of studies being done that one of the things of people in the 21st century is especially the younger generation, that there's a lack of hope. There's a sense of loneliness, of no future. And I just want to encourage some of our listeners, if you find yourself in that, I think the author of Hebrews is saying here, hey, if you're depressed, if you have no hope, there is hope. But that hope is put in God, in his son, Jesus Christ. And I think that's a message that as believers in Jesus, we need to be a hopeful people, if I can say that.
Yeah.
And I know it may sound preachy to some people, but that's part of the hope that we do have. You know, that we're not isolated, that we're not alone, that in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the hurt and injustice in this world, there is hope, because there is one that promised that not only in the past and the present, but also in the future will return and set things straight. So I think that's what the author of Hebrews can just encourage us to know, that there are better promises. There are promises that we can latch on to and hope in, and it's part of God's covenant of who he said he is and what he will do.
That's right. That's right. And he continues to go on explaining this more in depth. Read chapter 9. The rest of chapter 8, I think, is that big quote that you mentioned from Jeremiah. Chapter 9 is comparing, the old covenant ministry with the new covenant ministry. And there's so much here about this subject. This is sort of more of like a little introduction into this big theme. But I guess one more question I had, Doc, was what do you think he's trying to help them let go of? The people he's writing to. Why does he keep
Yeah,
emphasizing, hey, there's something better in comparison to what you've known. There's something
yeah,
that better. There's a better hope, like you mentioned. There's a
yeah,
better covenant. There's a better promises. What do you think people were holding on to that he was trying to? I guess if maybe I'm reading into it, but seeing like, hey, let go of that because there is something better that he's offering us. That has come, that has been
yeah,
fulfilled, if you will. What was you think the goal of the author to
yeah.
the people then that would have read this?
I think more than anything, they were persecuted people. Some of them were thrown in jail, as the author of Hebrews also makes very clear. So there were pressures. There were pressures by society, whether it was pagan society or even religious society. We know some of the Sadducees and some of the religious establishment did persecute the apostles. The apostles Peter, and so many of them we also know from Acts chapter 7. Stephen was killed. Paul was one of those persecutors. So I think in the midst of all of this, there were some that were asking themselves, is this really worth it? Is it worth
Hmm.
it to lose my possessions, as the author of Hebrews makes clear? Is it worth it for me to go to jail? Is it worth it for me to lose my job? Is it worth it? And he's saying, hey, yes, it is, because we still have that hope, and we have better promises. And of course, the better covenant and the fulfillment in Jesus the Messiah.
That's so good. And that applies to us today still,
Yeah.
to not hold on to put our hope in anything else.
Hmm.
Like Paul says, we even when we mourn, we don't mourn like those without hope.
Yeah.
That even though we may be in the already but not yet, like you
Hmm.
mentioned, that some stuff may not work out right now. We hold on to that hope, we hold on to the promise, and we hold on to the covenant that has been given to us through Jesus. So
Amen.
thank you so much, Doc. Obviously, so much we can get into in the covenant. I'm sure we will, because this is something that is just all over the New Testament. So, but hopefully, this can be a
Yeah.
sort of an overview of what that means when you see those terms. Hopefully, all of you listening have a better understanding of that, and this was beneficial to you. And we will see you in our next episode. Thank you so much for supporting this, for sharing this with people, for subscribing and all that stuff. Leaving a comment is really encouraging and helps us know what you guys also have questions on and what we can cover next. And we'll see you next time as we continue to know Jesus through the Bible.
Bye bye. Take care. God bless.